The American Civil War was a defining moment in the history of the United States. It was a conflict that tore the nation apart, pitting brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. The war began in the spring of 1861. It raged for 4 long years, finally ending in 1865. It remains the bloodiest war in American history. More American soldiers died in this single conflict than in all other wars combined. The war was fought between the northern states, known as the Union, and the southern states, which had seceded to form the Confederate States of America. To understand this great and terrible war, begin with a map. A simple 1861 map shows the fault lines of the conflict. It lets us trace the journey from the first shots in the south to pivotal battles in the border states in the north. We can follow armies across the landscape, through dense forests, over rolling hills, along vital rivers. Each point on the map represents more than a place, a story, a struggle, a moment that shaped the nation. This map is our guide through years of sacrifice and transformation. The lines were drawn by geography and by powerful beliefs. The causes of the Civil War were complex. They revolved around a few fundamental issues that had divided the nation for decades. The most significant and deeply rooted cause was the institution of slavery. In the southern states, the economy was overwhelmingly agricultural, built upon vast plantations, cotton, tobacco, sugar. This entire economic system was dependent on the labor of millions of enslaved African Americans. The South's way of life, its culture, its prosperity, were inextricably linked to the continuation of slavery. In the North, slavery had largely died out. A growing abolitionist movement viewed it as a moral evil that must be stopped. Another major cause was the debate over states' rights versus the power of the federal government. Many Southern leaders championed the idea that individual states had the right to govern themselves, and even to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The North was rapidly industrializing: factories, railroads, manufacturing, trade. The South remained agrarian. The election of Abraham Lincoln as president in 1860 was the final spark. The war began not on a sprawling battlefield, but at a small, isolated outpost in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Fort Sumter, a federal fort held by a small garrison of Union soldiers, became the first symbol of the nation's fracture. Following its secession, South Carolina demanded that the U.S. Army abandon the fort. President Lincoln, however, refused to surrender federal property to the newly formed Confederacy. He saw the fort as a symbol of the Union's authority and was determined to hold it. He made the decision to send unarmed supply ships to resupply the fort's beleaguered garrison, a move he hoped would avoid provoking a fight. Confederate leaders in Charleston and in the Confederate capital of Montgomery, Alabama, viewed Lincoln's attempt to resupply the fort as an act of aggression. On the morning of April 12, 1861, after the Union commander at the fort refused a final demand for surrender, Confederate cannons opened fire. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. The small Union force, outnumbered and outgunned, could do little but endure the relentless shelling, until their fort was in ruins and their supplies were exhausted. On April 14th, Major Robert Anderson surrendered Fort Sumter. Miraculously, no one on either side had been killed during the bombardment itself. But the attack had a profound and immediate impact across the country. In the North, the firing on the American flag ignited a wave of patriotic fury. President Lincoln responded by issuing a call for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to put down the insurrection. As the war progressed, our map becomes marked with the names of battles that would define the struggle. One of the most significant of these was fought in the fields of western Maryland, near a small stream called Antietam Creek. On September 17, 1862, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, clashed with the Union's Army of the Potomac. Lee had invaded the North for the first time, hoping to win a decisive victory on Union soil. That might convince European powers like Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and provide aid. The battle that ensued became the single bloodiest day in American history. The fighting at Antietam was savage and unrelenting. It raged for 12 hours across a landscape that would become infamous. In a cornfield, along a sunken road later known as Bloody Lane, and at a stone bridge over the creek. By the end of the day, the fields were littered with the dead and wounded. Combined casualties for both sides reached a staggering 23,000 men, killed, wounded, missing. The battle was a tactical draw, as Lee's battered army was allowed to retreat back into Virginia. The Union victory at Antietam, however limited, provided President Lincoln with the opportunity he had been waiting for. 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This executive order declared that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently in rebellion against the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. In the summer of 1863, the map of the war saw two monumental events that occurred almost simultaneously, marking the definitive turning point of the conflict. In the East, General Robert E. Lee launched his second and most ambitious invasion of the North, bringing his army into Pennsylvania. He hoped a major victory there would shatter Northern morale and force the Lincoln administration to sue for peace. His army converged with the Union Army of the Potomac at a small crossroads town called Gettysburg for 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd. The two massive armies engaged in the largest and deadliest battle ever fought on American soil, with fighting that raged on hills named Little Round Top, Culp's Hill. The climax came on the third day with Pickett's charge, a disastrous frontal assault by some 12,500 Confederate soldiers. At the very same time, another critical battle was reaching its conclusion far to the west. For months, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had been conducting a brilliant but difficult campaign to capture the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg, Mississippi, perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Grant's army surrounded the city, and after a grueling 47-day siege, the starving Confederate soldiers and citizens of Vicksburg finally surrendered on July 4, 1863, 1 day after the victory at Gettysburg. With control of Vicksburg, the Union now commanded the entire length of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. The Civil War was a conflict of staggering human cost, a tragedy that touched nearly every family in the nation. The numbers alone are difficult to comprehend. Over the course of 4 years, more than 620,000 soldiers died. From combat, disease, accidents. This figure represents roughly 2% of the entire American population at the time. To put that in perspective, a similar loss today would mean the deaths of over 6 million people. Many more hundreds of thousands of men were wounded, maimed for life, left psychologically scarred by the horrors they had witnessed on the battlefield. The war consumed a generation of young men. The life of a common soldier was one of extreme hardship and constant danger. They were often young, some just boys, who had left farms and workshops with romantic notions of glory. They soon discovered the grim reality of war: long marches in grueling weather, poor food, inadequate shelter, the constant threat of death. For every soldier killed in battle, 2 died of disease. The war's toll was felt not just by the soldiers, but by the families they left behind. A simple knock on the door could bring devastating news of a husband, son, brother killed in action. In the center of this tumultuous period stood one of the most remarkable figures in American history: Abraham Lincoln. When he became president in March 1861, he inherited a nation that was already falling apart. His primary goal from the very beginning of the war was to preserve the Union. He did not believe that states had the right to secede, and was convinced that the American experiment in democracy was a sacred trust. Lincoln was a masterful politician and a brilliant wartime leader. He navigated the treacherous political waters of Washington, balancing different factions. He possessed a rare combination of pragmatism and unwavering moral conviction. He made difficult, sometimes controversial decisions because he believed they were necessary to save the Republic. Through it all, he communicated his vision to the American people with extraordinary power and clarity. One of his most enduring articulations of this vision came in November 1863, at the dedication of a national cemetery on the battlefield of Gettysburg. In a speech that lasted just over 2 minutes, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. He eloquently redefined the meaning of the war, framing it as a struggle not just to save the Union, but to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. He called upon the living to ensure that the soldiers who died at Gettysburg had not died in vain, and that the nation would have a new birth of freedom. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. In his second inaugural address, he called on the nation to act with malice toward none, with charity for all. By the spring of 1865, the map of the Confederacy had shrunk dramatically. The Union war machine, under General Ulysses S. Grant, had ground down the Southern armies. Grant pursued a strategy of total war, aimed at defeating Confederate armies and destroying the South's economic ability. In the West, Sherman led his march to the sea, scenes of destruction crippling the Confederacy. In the East, Grant engaged Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in a brutal war of attrition. Beginning spring 1864, the armies were locked in constant bloody struggle. The campaign culminated in a long siege of Petersburg, the vital supply hub for Richmond. After a 9-month siege, Lee's army, exhausted, starving, vastly outnumbered, abandoned Petersburg and Richmond in early April 1865. Lee hoped to escape south and link up with other Confederate forces, but Grant's forces pursued relentlessly, cutting off escape routes. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee met Grant to discuss surrender. The meeting took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. Grant, echoing Lincoln's wish for a compassionate peace, offered generous terms. Lee accepted. The Army of Northern Virginia officially surrendered. The war was effectively over. The Union had been preserved. The most profound outcome was the abolition of slavery. 4 million people who had been held in bondage were now free. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified, formally abolishing slavery across the United States. The Civil War left deep, lasting scars, but it also reshaped the nation for the better. It was a crucible that tested the nation's highest ideals and, at an almost unimaginable cost, affirmed them. The war's true legacy is that the Union is perpetual, liberty is worth fighting for, and the nation, though tested by fire, could endure.